Hello and welcome to the introduction to the FAIR initiative. My name is Luis Bonino and this lecture is part of the FAIR Principles and the Verification Process course of the University of Twente. In this lecture, we will discuss the why, how, what, who, and where related to the FAIR Principles and some of the things that happen after their creation. If you don't know what the FAIR Principles are or haven't heard about them, or if you have heard about them but don't know exactly what they are, what they mean, what they entail, you are in the right place. Let's start with why do we need the FAIR Principles? From the last decades, we have been dealing with an increasingly complex and heterogeneous reality. Organizations have to deal with a large number of providers, technologies, and platforms. This happens not because we love chaos, but because our organizations are increasingly complex. And to better deal with this complexity, we normally break the problem down into smaller parts and then search for solutions for these smaller problems. Then we have a variety of different solutions for the broken down problems that need to be integrated so that we can have a global view of the organization. And also, the process can be as efficient as possible. In a scenario like this, when we need a solution for a problem, we have a number of questions to answer. How do I know what's available? Is there a place where I can see options for solutions for my problem? Then we need to know where we can get the solutions or whatever we are looking for. Maybe it's a data, it's a piece of software, it's a service. After we know where to get, we need to know how to get it. Is there any specific method or protocol to get our hands on the solution? Nice. Now we have one solution for a particular problem. Since we are assuming that we have complex issues, we probably need different solutions for these different problems, right? Then how can we integrate them? How can we get, for instance, integrate my data with the other data sets that I have or in my analysis workflow? Once we have our integrated solution, it will be very useful to streamline it so that we or others in the future can reuse this integrated solution if they have similar problems. Jumping from the scenario of complex and heterogeneous environments to work with data, we have several surveys that try to identify how data experts spend their time. This is one of these surveys, but from those that I've seen, they are very close in their results, maybe changing 1 or 2 percentage points up and down. Here, we see that they split the activities in collecting data sets, cleaning and organizing data, building training sets, mining data for patterns, refining the algorithms, and other activities. If we look at the time division, most of the time is spent in collecting data sets and cleaning and organizing them. Of course, in this paper, they assume that you have already found the data, which you know is not always the case. Basically, this survey identified that roughly 80% of the time of a data expert is spent on data preparation. Let's get some perspective here. The results of this survey shows that from the 5 days of a work week, the data expert spends 4 days getting the data, cleaning and organizing them. In other words, the data or domain expert that has been trained to understand and analyze a given domain can only apply this knowledge in 1 day per week, because the other 4 days he or she has to spend doing something else, because data were not in a good shape in the first place. This sounds very inefficient, right? The hope here is that with better data treatment, data management and stewardship from the beginning, we can at least invert these numbers, spending 1 day preparing the data and the other 4 days analyzing them. If we break down the steps we go through to work with data, we could argue that we first need to find the data. We cannot work with something that we don't know even where it is. So it seems that finding is a fundamental step here. Once we've found them, we need to know how to get the data. Are there specific steps or procedures that I need to follow to access the data? Things like log in or follow this address, a specific protocol. Is there something that I need to know before in order to guide me how to get to the data? Now that we have the data we found, we will proceed to integrate with other data that we already had, use them in our analysis algorithm, in our workflow, etc. Finally, all the efforts used in producing the data for us or others to find, access, and interpret can be leveraged by reusing them. and reused by those who created the data, but also for others. Another aspect here is that in many cases, people will reuse the data, repurposing them. This means that the data will be used in a different context than the one for which they have been created. It's not coincidence that these steps compose the acronym FAIR. But what is FAIR? It all started in January 2014 in Leiden, in the Netherlands. There, we had a workshop called Jointly Designing a Data Fairport, where over 30 people from all over the world got together for 4 days to discuss the problems related to working with data and try to find a solution. The participants ranged from researchers to funding agencies to policymakers. Although in the title of the workshop we already had the word FAIR, at that moment it didn't mean findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable. It was a wordplay between the word fair in the regular dictionary sense and the word airport. The idea was to represent the scenario of an airport, where a complex and heterogeneous environment involves different people from different places, airlines from all over the world operating different airplanes of different manufacturers, different configurations, other types of organizations like airport administration, shops, police, and these things kind of work because they are based on some common agreements. Agreements like our passports that have been issued in different countries can be checked, contain a common set of information about us, and in many cases can be read by machines. Another example is the QR code of our tickets that allows us to enter the boarding area and eventually board the airplane that will take us to our destination, hopefully. The airport environment was the inspiration for the discussions of the workshop and hopefully could lead to a complex, global, and heterogeneous data environment with a given amount of interoperability. The actual FAIR acronym was created during drinks in one of the days of the workshop to represent those steps we discussed before. One of the conclusions of the workshop was that it would be useful to try to condense the discussions in a set of principles to serve as guidelines with the goal of improving data stewardship. After the meeting in January 2014, we kept exchanging messages and working towards the principles, which culminated with the publication of a paper named the FAIR Guiding Principles for Scientific Data Management in Stewardship in March 2016. In this paper, we motivated and presented the FAIR principles. It seems that the paper came at the right time as a growing number of people started to realize that we need significant improvements in data stewardship as the current practice were no longer sustainable. From March 2016 to March 2022, the paper has been cited over 6,800 times, which gives us a hint that there was a need for such guidelines. In January 2017, less than a year after the publication of the FAIR Principles paper, the European Commission started including aspects related to FAIR in the Manual for Horizon 2020 proposals. Also, the Commission started work on the European Open Science Cloud, a distributed infrastructure to facilitate the reuse of research data and services around Europe. It has been defined that EOSC should be based on the FAIR principles and that it should be part of the global network of FAIR data and services. In this context, there are estimations that the market for data stewardship should be over $85 billion annually. And the Commission also already invested several billion euros in the start of EOSC. Another political consequence of the FAIR principles is that 6 months after the publication of the paper, in September 2016, the principles were explicitly mentioned in the official report of the G20 summit in China. In the report, they say that the G20 countries support efforts and will facilitate access to publicly funded research on FAIR. Following the example of the G20, in 2017, the G7 also included the FAIR principles in their report of the annual summit in Italy. And finally, here are the principles. We have 10 principles, 15 if you count the sub-principles, divided in 4 aspects: findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable. Later on, we will look at them in more detail. One important point that I would like to highlight here is that is explicitly mentioned in the paper that the principles target primarily machines. Of course, we never intended to remove humans from the process, but the idea is that having the principles target the machines allows them to help us. The motivation here is that, given the enormous amount of increasingly complex and heterogeneous data we are constantly creating nowadays, we cannot cope with them by ourselves anymore. We need the machines to help us with the heavy lifting, leaving us with the things that we are good at, like using our background knowledge, analyzing, reaching conclusions, inferring, combining background and the current information that we got from analyzing the data and so forth. But for the machines to help us at the level we have intended, they first needed to understand what we mean. Of course, the understanding part here is very limited given the capabilities of machines to parse and interpret data and information. However, we can only describe things in the level of details that machines can interpret if, first, we really understand what we are describing. So basically, the machines should understand what we mean, but first we should understand what we mean in a very clear and unambiguous way. In the next part, we'll discuss the FAIR principles in more detail.